Welcome to the new age. Politics, economics, and social strife are things of the past. A time of boundless technological potential. Drugs to combat illness and disease. Sustainable lifestyles, harmonious societies. The means to communicate our feelings with passion and thoughtfulness beyond physical abilities.
No.
Tonight at 10.
Tonight on BBC London.
Hello and welcome to the
Programme tonight.
Good evening, exactly.
Good evening. With just
Good
days
evening.
to
In
go.
the age of maximising
Donald Trump told a rally in Vermont last night.
This is the 21st century. A strange time of 24-hour news, contradictory stories about health, and adverts about erectile dysfunction.
I don't have to tell you things are bad. Everybody knows things are bad.
Celebrities are born and die in the blink of an eye.
Dollar buys a nickel's worth. Banks are going bust. Shopkeepers keep a gun under the counter.
Economics and extremism, two strands defining the first decades of the political century.
The week in which a bunch of loser jihadists slaughtered 132 innocents in Paris.
But what binds this generation together?
I need to share everything about me, but I still demand my privacy. I need a privilege.
Everything about me.
Take a look at this picture of a cat.
Viral
Hashtag
video.
self-important cliche phrase.
I'm secretly a badger and an African gazelle and a can of Febreze, impersonating a human being.
Join us as we discuss the stories making the headlines in the UK and around the world. Duncan Watson, Gordon Watson, Scott Baxter, Tom Davenport, and special guests. Sit back and relax as you listen to the Vox Mews Show.
Hello and welcome to the Vox Mews Show. In this special edition of the Vox Mews Show, we talk about the potential effects of a Brexit on the National Health Service. To talk about this, we spoke to Dr. Michael Walsh, who is a lecturer and academic in the Stirling University Management School. In this detailed hour-long interview, we talk about the structure, function, funding, and effects of immigration on the National Health Service. Enjoy.
Vox Mews.
If you'd just like to introduce yourself first, what position you have, that kind of thing.
Alright, okay. I'm Dr. Mike Walsh. I'm in the Management School in the Division of Management, Work and Organisation, and I've got a particular interest in the management of health services, so in particular the NHS in Scotland, and I've got projects underway relating to the redesign of addiction services, but also work internationally. So I work with the Ministry of Health in Ghana, for instance, and I worked there recently on a UNDP GEF funded project on the impacts of climate change on local health policy. So I have strong interests across the field. And I used to be a practicing nurse, so I cut my teeth, maybe that's the wrong metaphor, but I started out as a nurse specialist in what was then the care of the elderly, but I later came to see as the care of older people.
Okay. So by now, or maybe you haven't, have you taken a position yet on Brexit?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, crystal clear.
Can I ask what that is?
Yes, yeah. I'm going to vote for the Remain camp, or, vote to stay in the European Union. I think exiting the European Union at this time will be very difficult for the United Kingdom in a lot of ways, and the pain will last for decades. I don't think this is going to be a short-run decision in the same way that EU membership has taken 40 years to get to this point. I think you can look at it taking another 40 years to get to the post-UK position outside of the European Union. And I think the consequences are likely to be rather unpredictable.
Okay. So you must still have sources inside the NHS.
Oh, yes.
What's the impression that they're giving you from the ground level?
Right, so, well, there is nothing that I get which is specifically about the European Union. What I do get from everybody that I know in the National Health Service is that morale is low and pressure is extremely high. And this is primarily because the NHS is the cheapest health service that delivers high quality care to its population in the world. If you look for expenditure on healthcare, Italy spends more than the United Kingdom on healthcare. Italy has more doctors per head of population than the United Kingdom. Germany has a lot more doctors. They have more of everything. There are more hospital beds in almost every other European country and the US compared to the UK. The UK provides, and the National Health Service in the UK provides arguably, the most cost-effective, high-quality service in the world. But there's a price, and the price is it's cheap. And because it's cheap, it's sensitive. So people start getting worried about, for example, immigration. But there's no point blaming immigrants for the problems of the NHS. The problems of the NHS are caused by a lack of inward investment. If the UK invested the same level in healthcare as, for example, Italy or Germany, then you'd see a difference. But that difference would also come at a price, which is that it will cost more money. Now, the other key factor in the way that the NHS is progressing is that, like all health services right the way around the world, healthcare is becoming more expensive, and more people are around who need healthcare. So the costs of healthcare are increasing, and they're increasing astronomically. So by 2061, Appleby from King's Fund forecasts the US healthcare spend will rise from round about current 17% of GDP to 50% of GDP. In the UK, healthcare spending is round about 6.87% of GDP, and that's going to rise to 17% of GDP. Now, most people haven't really understood this. They haven't understood that healthcare costs are rising. It's a greater proportion of national income that is being spent on it. And that's going to happen whether the UK is in the EU or outside of the EU. And it's got very little to do with immigration. That's just the little bit of pressure on the end. The system itself is already highly pressurised. Demand is outstripping supply, and you can see that in the way that waiting times are increasing in the NHS right now, and in the way that the NHS is now doing a lot more operations than it was, say, 10 years ago. There's just a lot more healthcare activity than there was 10 years ago. It's not just the National Health Service. This is a pattern even in developing countries. You go to very poor healthcare systems, and they face exactly the same phenomenon, which is that healthcare is getting more expensive. So the NHS is under extreme pressure.
And why is that?
It's because of, well, two things. First of all, there are a number of factors. But the reason that healthcare is going up in cost, particularly in, say, the UK, but also European and the US in particular, is because there are more people. There are more people with long-term conditions. People are surviving longer. Because they're surviving longer, they need more healthcare. People used to die at the age of 50, then they died at the age of 60, then they died at the age of 70. Current life expectancy for the UK for men is 79 years. That's improved. You could argue it's a fantastic triumph. Although you'd have to say that most of that improvement has come from better sanitation, less medicine, more to do with improved nutrition and better hygiene. But it also means that because people are living longer, they're living longer with diseases that ordinarily would that have succumbed to, say, even 30 years ago. People survive with cancer. They can live with diabetes. When somebody has diabetes, they have all sorts of health complications, each of which generates additional need for treatment. And every time somebody gets sick in a particular way, more money has to be spent. And the number of people who are in the very oldest category is going to double over the next 10 or 20 years. So we have 1 million more people who will need lots more healthcare. It's got nothing to do with immigration, that is purely to do with the demographics of the population and survival. All that immigration does is just add that little bit of additional pressure. It could be seen as the straw that breaks the camel's back because you want to try and keep demand as low as possible. But the fundamental problem is that actually people are living longer with more conditions. That's got nothing to do with immigration. And we don't spend as much in the UK as we do in other countries.
And yet we're being given a claim that the Scottish population, the UK population as a whole, will increase to, by 2030, there's claims of it being about the size of Scotland in terms of population.
The population is forecast to rise from NHS Confederation stats to around about 70 million by 2030. Mm-hmm. That it's not surprising. There are movements around the world. I don't think those movements will stop, even in or out of the European Union. In fact, in some ways, those movements are seen as highly desirable, particularly for healthcare, particularly for the NHS. We actually depend on a lot of people coming here in order to provide nursing care, physician care, even back office operations or back office work that you don't even normally think of. So, for instance, biomedical laboratories undertake all of the analysis of bodily fluids and tissues that form the basis of clinical decision making. So whenever you go and see your doctor, the doctor or a nurse or somebody takes some blood from you, that goes off to a laboratory, it's analysed, it comes back with a report. On the basis of that report, a clinical decision can be made. Take away that service and there's a serious problem. It means that you can't make really critical decisions. And yet our biomedical laboratories are actually staffed with a large proportion of people from overseas. Actually, a lot of Australians.
Is this to do with the lack of skills in the UK job place?
It might have something to do with that. It's certainly got something to do with people being more mobile around the world. And it also probably is to do with the failure to train up and recruit people here, because it's actually very often cheaper to go and get them from overseas. Why train up a nurse in Britain when you can get a nurse trained up in, say, Ghana and then bring them here for a couple of years? So what's happened is that we're using international workforces as cheap, flexible labour. So to that extent, there's an argument around that overseas labour, or EU labour in particular, is undermining the value of British labour, and that, I think, is correct. I think that international labour is actually undermining what you can earn from your job here. But the problem is, it's not just the EU, because if you cut off EU sources of labour, well, we'll get it from elsewhere. And in the health service, I'm not overwhelmed by the number of people that are coming from the EU to work in the NHS. Actually, they're coming from India. Yeah. They're coming from Africa. They're coming from Indonesia. They're coming from everywhere, but not the EU. And why is that? Well, if you are a nurse and you qualify in Ghana, then you can either carry on working extremely hard at a very low rate of pay, or you can go and take your nursing qualification and come to the UK, and you can earn a wage that is unparalleled in your family's history, and you can send a lot of that money home. It's ironic. But if they didn't come here, who would actually deliver the nursing care? Who would actually staff the GP surgeries? I've seen a figure today, I think, that indicates that 1 in 8 GP jobs are currently unfilled. And I have to check that statistic. But there is a problem within general practice. So who's going to fill these general practitioner posts? Well, we're not going to train up a whole generation of people to fill these jobs. We're going to go and get them from somewhere else. Where are they going to come from? Well, a lot of people in Europe won't come here. I had a colleague in Hull whose job was to recruit German psychiatrists.
Why them specifically?
Because they were seen as competent and good English speakers, and it was assumed, this is about 15 years ago, it was assumed that NHS salaries for psychiatry would be very attractive because there were quite a lot more than you would get for German psychiatrists. And his job was to go and find them and headhunt them and bring them here because we have a shortage of psychiatrists. And he couldn't induce a single person to come and work, to come and give up their far more controlled case load in Germany and substitute it for the extreme high pressure and very high caseload that you would get working in the NHS in the UK. And just by the by, there are more Ghanaian psychiatrists working as psychiatrists from Ghana in Scotland than there are psychiatrists in Ghana. Which is an interesting thought, the way that a well-developed economy like the UK or Scotland distorts the situations of other countries.
Just on that point, the impression I get from speaking to older people who have known a time before the NHS, but then have lived through it since 1947, 48. Now, it could be seen in our generation as a racial statement, but that they don't like the idea of being treated by a foreign doctor. Now, it's regardless of their merits, probably because they're equivalent. It's the feeling that I'd sooner see a British Caucasian person than I would, as you say, an Indian doctor or a Ghanaian doctor.
Yeah, and it's not just an old generation issue either. I think there's a younger generation version of that. That there is no limit to prejudices. People can only express the culture that they've been encultured in. So they are, to a large extent, a product of where they've come from. So if you come from a particular place, you are immersed in people who have attitudes that are negative or contain stereotypes, then you're more likely to adopt those. So I know from my personal family experience how difficult members of my family have found it when being dealt with by somebody from another country. Sometimes it matters, sometimes it doesn't. It matters usually in terms of effectiveness of communication. But on the other hand, I've been treated by British people with just a strong local accent, and I found it difficult to communicate because I'm not quite sure what it is that is being said. It's got nothing to do with ethnicity. If you accept that British people, white Caucasians, are all pretty much the same, but we vary, don't we? You know, as a white Caucasian, speaking to white Caucasians, we vary. So, even we are not all the same.
You say that immigration doesn't play, it's not a huge part, but then can you give us any figures as to, or statistics as to how much of a, let's say, burden in this case, because we're talking about the leave side?
Yeah, I thought about that before this interview. Do I know how many additional immigrants there are in the UK over the past year and over the past, say, 10 years? How many non-resident immigrants does the NHS have to deal with? And I don't really know, actually. I know that the NHS deals with 1 million people every 36 hours. Right? 1 million people every 36 hours.
That's 1 in 6 of the population, isn't it?
Yes.
Every 1.5 days.
Yes. Yeah, that's NHS Confederation statistics. So 1 million people every 36 hours. I think immigrants are actually just a small proportion of that. What are we talking about? 5% of the population. And what do we mean by immigrant? Even the word immigrant is difficult. I mean, do we actually include students in that? Temporary residents, people who are here who are not permanently resident
from
here.
that local area.
What burden do they all face? But the primary difficulty is not the fact of immigration, it is the fact of underinvestment in healthcare. The UK likes cheap healthcare. The British public want cheap healthcare. They're not prepared to spend another, say, 3% of their taxation on healthcare. But if they did, actually, the current pressures would ease. And you couldn't then argue that these immigrants are coming here filling up our hospitals. It's rubbish. It's complete balderdash.
So how do you sell that to the British public? The idea that you pay an extra 3% and say, the burdens, the situations, the tensions you face right now can all subside over time if you pay an extra 3%.
It's very difficult. There is some evidence that I've seen in the past that people will pay tax if they understand what they are getting for it. So apothecary taxes that are dedicated for a specific purpose. But there are also quite a lot of people who I know are really utterly opposed to the idea of taxation. So you've got the competition between those who are individually saying you should have your individual resources, you should rely on yourself. And there are quite a lot of people who are supporting that. Boris Johnson supports that. Michael Gove supports that. They're talking about the idea of charging for NHS services. So we must start charging. You have to be self-reliant.
I think it was an insurance-based health service that Nigel Farage called.
So planning on introducing an American system?
Well, this was David Marsland and Ralph Siegelman, 1989, from Cradle to Grave, called the NHS a monopolistic monster. So they represented the new right at that time. And they were saying that Britain should have a Swiss-style system. You pay for your own healthcare and you have a top-up. You have a safety net system to catch anybody who can't actually pay for their own care. Actually, in Switzerland, they also send the bill to you for your relative if your relative can't pay. So there's a familial liability element to it. But here's the thing that everybody ought to be really scared about. If you look at, say, the US system or any of the insurance-based systems, they all cost a lot more than the National Health Service. The National Health Service is actually very low cost. All other systems have far more beds, far more facilities, far more doctors and nurses and other people, and they spend more money.
Why is that?
You can see that the greatest example of this is the United States, where you've got, it's an individual system. You've got, healthcare facilities whose job is to make a profit. Your job as a shareholder is to maximize the profit of your institution. So how do you do that? Well, you sell your good or service to the patient. The patient clearly is sick and clearly needs to be treated. And there's very little reward or incentive there to actually regard somebody as well. You have to regard them as sick in order to sell them something. So you can either sell them weight loss products, bearing in mind that you've got obesity and overweight as a serious problem in American society, right the way around the world, of course. And then on top of that, you've got very sophisticated insurance systems that offer you absolutely unparalleled quality of service, which the American public demand. But they also have around about 20 to 30 million people who have no health insurance and therefore can't even access basic health care except through philanthropy, charity. And they can only get whatever the local philanthropic centre is willing to provide. Might be a public hospital that might not really be able to cope with the demand that creates. Now, Obama, of course, tried to introduce something called Obamacare, which used to extend
the Affordable Care Act.
Affordable care, that's right, through an insurance system to extend insurance to all these other people. But the Americans don't like that. They don't like socialised medicine. They don't like the idea of NHS-style care. But NHS-style care is a lot cheaper. It's much more cost effective. The NHS provides nearly 100% coverage. Very few people can avoid getting the healthcare they actually need in Britain. Compared to the US, where actually there might not be any healthcare for you. You know, lots of perverse incentives within the consumerist system. But you also see that consumerist model actually very strongly associated with cost inflation right the way around the world. It's not just an American problem. But it is a dominant model. You know, you can't avoid the fact that the Americans are pushing this like mad. A lot of people would look at the NHS and they would criticise some aspects of it, but at the same time, you've got to say, I think the argument is that the NHS provides more high quality care more cost effectively to more people than any other system on the planet.
But I mean, you can't escape the fact that it's a great selling feature, the idea that by giving so much money, and we still don't have a clear idea of how much actually gets sent to the EU per week or year, that money taken back into our economy can then be invested in building new hospitals.
Well, that's the Farage argument and so on, isn't it? You know, £350 million a week, the mythical £350 million a week, because it's not that, it's less than that. But let's work with the figure of £350 million. That is a fully equipped, fully staffed hospital. Yeah, okay, it could be. Where would you put this one hospital? Would you put it in Birmingham so that roundabout 250,000 people could benefit from it? So it wouldn't therefore benefit Newcastle, or it wouldn't benefit Manchester, and it wouldn't benefit Glasgow. You know, you can only build one hospital with that money. Let's think about it. Actually, in the UK, there is a spend of around about $3,000 equivalent purchasing power per person. In Germany, it's $4,000 per person. So $3,000 per person, call it £2,500, something like that. Multiply that by 60 million. And then how far does your £350 million go? And the answer is it doesn't go very far, actually. It's not a big sum of money. It's a small proportion of the amount that is spent each year on the NHS. The NHS in the UK costs round about, I think it's 116,000 million, of which about 10 billion is spent in Scotland. 116,000 million. Which is, on a weekly basis, we'll divide it by 52. What does that come out at? There we are. We spend about 2 billion a week on the NHS. 2,000 million pounds a week. It's actually more than that. It's actually 2.2 billion. 2,200 million pounds a week. So that extra 350 million a week for membership of the European Club, it actually makes just a small difference. And the bigger difference to that NHS spend won't come from that 350 million. It will actually come from the fact that within another 5-10 years, there will be even more people who need that money spending on them. That 350 million will disappear within a few years. It will be small change. It's already relatively small change. It will become vanishingly small change. So, you're not going to get very much by spending your 350 million a week.
Of course, this is just on the NHS as well. We know that the Leave campaign has made gargantuan claims about the...
Oh yes, that 350 million is going to do all sorts of things. So, okay, so what if we invest this money somehow? This is the question that the British public ought to ask themselves. we've got £350 million a week. What's going to produce the biggest socio-economic benefit for the UK? That's what the argument is about. And apparently some people seem to think that by spending it in the UK, we're going to get more benefit than by spending it in the European Union. Now, there is a problem. You can only invest the money once. There's an opportunity cost that goes with it. And most business leaders have worked out that actually investing overseas is smart. You can invest in the UK to a certain extent. But it's not because of the European Union that lots of industries have decanted to India and China and other places where they get their goods and services produced at very low cost. It's not the EU that's stolen British call centres. It's India. It's Dyson, who is actually apparently advocating leaving the EU, has actually moved most of his production to Asia. No, he's not moved it to the EU. He's moved it to the cheapest place. He's actually grumbling about the costs of actually trying to maintain his factories here in the UK. Well, he's sorted that problem out. They've been made in Vietnam, I think, now, Dyson's. Right, so the EU is actually a very low-cost club, I think, for a very high rate of return. What we get for it is a level playing field with some bumps, but a level playing field with a large number of other countries. There are issues around migration and movement of people that needs to be addressed. Germany has absorbed over 1 million refugees compared to tens of thousands here in the UK. I don't think that is sustainable. I think, I think that needs to be addressed somehow. And what is necessary is greater coordination, not greater fragmentation. Just at the time when we should be pulling together, certain people are saying, that's it, we've had enough, let's pull apart. When the going gets tough, it looks like, well, the weaklings are getting going. I say, stick together. I say, solve the problems of the EU. Face up to them, actually.
In what ways does the EU actually impact on the NHS in Scotland?
Right, the main impact is in terms of the economy. So, it's fairly obvious. If leaving the EU damages the gross domestic product of the United Kingdom and of Scotland, then it means that what is currently difficult will get even more difficult. That's the primary problem. And there are forecasts that there will be a shock to the economy. The shock will begin immediately the vote is taken. The posturing has already commenced. People are already insuring themselves against a UK exit. It's primarily about the economic shock to the system. Membership of the EU helps to assure the continued productivity of the economy. We actually depend on the EU, and I accept that trade will never finish with the EU, but I don't think the terms will ever be as good. I think we will, if we leave the EU, we'll have collectively driven ourselves a harder bargain, and that is nuts. That's a really silly way to proceed. What we want is a good bargain. I don't think we'll get one.
What about the claims about health tourism, though? Are they as bad as they?
No, it's small. It's a very small component. It vanishes. The main need for the NHS is for GPs, and we're short of 1 in 8 GPs apparently. Doctors, the Germans have got 4 doctors for every 3 or 2 doctors of the British NHS. It's that health tourism. It's a very small component.
Okay. I only ask because it's a claim that's been presented, but at the same time, can you explain how it works in Scotland? Because I've heard some things, but I don't know.
I have to say that I probably know more about England in some respects. Even though I've been in Scotland 10 years, I still know more about England than I know about Scotland. And you have to go to particular places where you will find certain extreme effects. So you might go to, say, London. Certain communities will be particularly badly affected by the large number of people coming in, maybe as health tourists, for example. But you'll also find a bigger mix. You'll find lots of private clinics, lots of private hospitals attracted by the size of that particular market. Most people aren't affected by that at all. I stay in Kinross. Nobody is health tourism is not a problem at Lochleven Health Centre. It's not a problem in Stirling. I don't think people are overwhelmed by lots of people coming here for operations. Actually, lots of British people go overseas for their operations. I have a business colleague I've known for many years who created and sold a whole business which was dedicated to taking people from the UK to hospitals overseas, giving them operations. I know a lady who had her varicose veins done in Hanoi. Why Hanoi? I have no idea, but that's what she did. So health tourism is something that goes both ways. Yeah. I'm quite sure that there are people that come here because they can get treatment, but it's not a big problem.
It's nothing to worry about, you would say.
It's not a big problem.
Okay. The SNP in their manifesto for the recent election, we're talking about creating and integrating social care with healthcare.
Yeah.
Because we're in the game of hypotheticals here. Could they still do that? I mean, they're talking about it. They're saying that they pull over £8 billion to do it.
Integration of health and social care is being seen right the way around the world as an important solution to the problem of rising costs of healthcare. The consumerist model, you could argue, has failed. The very fact that you get these extreme increases in costs because people are consuming healthcare. When you're insured for something, if you don't claim, you're not benefiting from the insurance that you're paying. So there is a perverse incentive if you're insured for something to get the treatment. So, for example, in the US, you have a headache, they'll have an MRI scan.
Making use of it.
Yeah. You've got the facility, you just send the insurance bill, will pay for it. So activity is inflated by the perverse incentive of insurance. Now, even in the NHS, we've got this massive cost inflation occurring. And that's without the perverse incentives of insurance, but we still have this massive increase in demand for healthcare, and everybody's looking around for a solution. So one of the key problems that health services have faced for decades, okay, so this is not a new problem. When I trained as a nurse in Rotherham in 1984, this was a problem, which is that somebody goes into hospital, they're treated for something, but they're actually quite fragile at the end of the treatment. They might be cured. They might have had a hip replacement. An older person has a hip replacement, and then the only thing they've got to do is to be able to go home. But they can't go home because there is no service at home to help them. If they went home and were left in their own house, they'd die, they'd starve to death, or they wouldn't take their medicines. You need care at home in order to enable people to leave hospital. And it's called bed blocking. And, listen to the tone of that. Bed blocking. You are a bed blocker. You are blocking that bed. Hospital beds are incredibly expensive. And this has been going on for decades, where a lack of coordination between healthcare and social care means that lots of costs are incurred within healthcare. In the US, you've got Don Berwick arguing that at least 20% of all healthcare is waste. So they've got their own view about pressure. We need to somehow save this money. So the obvious thing to do is to try and coordinate care. Don Berwick says this is a priority for the US health system. Actually, the English government and the Scottish government both feel the same way. There is a move towards integration of health and social care because by cooperating, we can reduce waste caused by, for example, somebody being in hospital longer than they need to be. But to do that means that we have to try and combine systems that have operated for so long separately that they don't mesh together very easily. So health service workers are not the same as social care workers. Local authority budgets are not the same as NHS budgets. Now, the first large-scale health and social care integration in the UK is that of the Highlands. They've got a fully integrated health and social care board. And they've got people who used to be working for the council, working in the NHS. They've got people who used to be in the NHS working for the council. They've looked at the budgets and they've transferred over the budgets and they've made it, or they're making it work. But it will take a long time to get people to work together effectively because for decades they've been treated separately. Health and social care integration is definitely a way forward. There's even a system that developed in Alaska, and it's called NUCA, which was trialled by NHS Tayside just a couple of years ago. Now, NUCA was designed for the ethnic Alaskan people who didn't have health insurance and weren't doing so well out of the Alaskan healthcare system. Now, the territory that NUCA was designed to cover is actually the size of the United Kingdom. And it's only about 5 million people. So it's actually like the population of Scotland spread out over the whole of the UK. But NUCA has been very effective. It's been described as non-medical healthcare, and it uses health resources in rather a different way. So physicians within the NUCA system doctors are regarded as equal to nurses and other professionals. In the British system, you still tend to have this hierarchy which is dominated by doctors at the top, and there's a pecking order that goes down. In the NUCA system, there's a much greater equality. There is still clinical responsibility, but community assets are mobilised, so people are much more self-caring, self-determining, much more resourceful. This is so interesting, and it's so successful. Don Berwick from the Institute for Healthcare Improvement in the United States is saying what a fantastic idea this is. And NHS Tayside and a couple of other boards wanted to try it in Scotland. NHS Tayside attempted to implement the system, and the trial was stopped. It was meant to run for 6 months, but it was stopped because of opposition from other GPs within the particular practice where the trial took place. So now you've got to ask yourself, well, why did such a smart idea get stopped in its tracks before it was actually properly evaluated? You know, why aren't we actually trialing a system that is integrated health and social care? Well, that's a complicated question, but it seems to be to do with identity. It's a competition for the position and status of being the general practitioner. That appeared to have been the problem in that case.
Was that why it was stopped? Because
that
was the nature of their opposition?
Yeah, the people who were actually involved in the trial carrying it out, they thought it was great, but the host practice in which it was situated objected, and eventually the trial was stopped, even though there was government money available to run the trial. And out of the 52 practices within NHS Tayside, not one other practice agreed to a trial of the NUCA system. So integrating health and social care, not easy, particularly not within our very status oriented, very hierarchical, culture-bound system. And it's not just Scotland, of course, it's England and Wales, where you meet the same problems.
Another issue that just comes to mind, talking about obesity. We're saying there that if we leave, we see that the high prices that we were paying for food, by being part of the European Union, reduced. And so, will that not be a benefit for us as far as obesity is concerned, seeing as it's such a huge health issue in Scotland?
Obesity is a problem, and the evidence I've been looking at recently, actually via the BBC, to be honest, Michael Mosley, blood sugar diet, and so on, the rise in the consumption of carbohydrates. In Scotland, alcohol is a major source of that, but rice, pasta, potatoes, all major sources of carbohydrate. The relationship between carbohydrate and being too heavy, it's not just a Scottish problem, it's a UK problem, it's a Western world problem, it's a Mexican problem. Mexico has the heaviest people on the planet, and that appears to be related to the volume of sugary drinks that they're consuming. Likewise, in Scotland, we have the promotion of lots of very, very high calorie, sugary energy drinks. Monster or whatever it is. My children buy the stuff. I see students drinking it. And the snag is that one or two cans, no problem. But over a period of time, people end up being heavier. They are heavier and they get all the health consequences of obesity.
I actually read an article not too long ago where a woman would drink a can a day, maybe more than that sometimes, of these energy drinks, Red Bull and so forth. And she went for a liver test, and she was told that her liver was in the state that they'd expect an extreme alcoholic to be.
Right.
So they're not just bad in terms of weight, but in terms of general overall health as well.
Yeah, it affects all body organs.
Yeah.
In fact, consuming carbohydrates leads to fat deposition in pancreas and liver, and this contradicts the idea that a low-fat diet is good for you. I was listening to two guys on Ready 4 this morning being interviewed by John Humphreys, Professor Pearson and Dr. Kendrick, I think they were called, and they're having a dispute over low-density lipids. Now, I have to say that I understood high-density lipids and low-density lipids have a relationship to each other. I thought that high-density lipids, which are the cholesterols that you get in things like bacon and egg, those are bad. Low-density lipids, I thought, were good.
It's the other way around.
These guys seem to be saying it's the other way around. Biomedical Basis of Gerontology, David Hall, 1984, reports the difference in value between concentration of low-density lipid and high-density lipid is the key factor in determining whether there is deposition of fats in arteries, veins, and other organs. The bottom line is that high carbohydrate actually also leads to high fat deposition, and that screws up your liver and it screws up your pancreas. And according to Michael Mosley from the BBC, it takes 2 weeks to clear your liver of fats, but it takes 8 weeks to clear your pancreas of fat deposition. So you need to be on a strict diet, 800 calories a day for 8 weeks, according to Mosley. I've done it. It works.
My final sort of two questions, I suppose. My first one is, if this goes ahead and we do end up leaving, is there anything positive about this for the NHS?
No, I don't think so. I can't see any positive benefit. I can see only negatives. The negatives are caused by the economic damage that the exit will create, and that will simply lead to more pressure on NHS budgets. It will mean effectively a deterioration. Appleby's forecast for the future of healthcare spending did not take account of the possible exit of the United Kingdom from the European Union. There are other considerations. So the EU as an institution is seriously flawed and needs fixing in some way. But exiting the EU is not the solution any more than breaking up the United Kingdom is the solution to the UK's problems.
And my final question is, you said already that other European nations, Germany, France, for example, have a system that seems to invest a great deal more in their health services. Should we just drop all this and start learning from them again? Learn from these European health systems. As you say, it's cheaper here, but investment seems to be the gift.
Is the problem? Yes, or the lack of investment is the main weakness. Yes, I think that Britain should invest more in healthcare. I think there is a great deal to be gained from it. It's valuable socio-economic activity, and it is more than it appears to be. Healthcare and the National Health Service is not actually just about getting people fixed up for health. That's not what it should be. What it should be is part of the socio-economic system, part of the way in which wealth is created, generated and distributed right the way around the UK. If you have a GP or a surgery on a remote island, you are distributing wealth to that remote island. It's part of the economic mechanism of the United Kingdom. It's a fantastic way of improving equity for the population. That stops the minute we start privatising the NHS and we start making it into an insurance-based system. It will cripple that function.
See, that's actually one of the arguments that's put forward about this. Actually, TTIP. One of the arguments by Leave is that TTIP has an adverse effect on the NHS by privatising it, or increasing the privatisation.
Right. Actually, I don't know very much about TTIP, I'm afraid. I've heard of it. I know that there are issues that I ought to be concerned about, but I'm afraid the week has only got so much reading time in it.
No, that's all right. That's okay.
But thank you for pointing out TTIP. I will definitely go and read upon the health effects of TTIP.
And there was just 2 quick questions, a bit off the topic of the EU referendum.
Yeah.
Well, not really, actually. How would a Brexit impact university research funding?
Again, I think that it will have an adverse impact. I think that it will make life a lot more difficult. The Vice-Chancellors generally are opposed to exit, I understand. I don't think there's
I think they wrote a letter to newspapers, didn't they? I think there was about 51 Vice-Chancellors or so.
Yeah, not that I'm actually that enamoured with the UK university system, which I think has got serious difficulties of its own, but I don't think that research is going to be helped by exiting the EU. Stephen Hawking has produced a little video clip in which he makes a very similar argument.
And just very finally, how did you vote in the 2014 Scottish independence referendum? And can you see the outcome of this vote influencing your EU referendum vote?
I voted for against Scottish independence. Okay. Although when asked the question, should Scotland be an independent country? My answer is yes, but I would still vote against against separation, but actually primarily for economic reasons. But self-determination and autonomy are healthy. To be dependent is unhealthy, and I see Scotland as unhealthily dependent on a dominating and domineering England, and I think the EU vote is an excellent example of that. I think that a lot of people in Scotland, it needs about 250,000 people to change their votes, and all of a sudden, instead of it being 55-45 against independence, you end up with close to 50-50. I think that the argument for Scottish independence is likely to be augmented by an EU exit, because it proves that actually the English can do to the Scots whatever they want.
Okay, Dr. Mike Walsh, thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Right then.
Vox Mews.